All right, so we clearly know who is the better fighter out of the two. DC versus Derek Lewis. Daniel Cormier coming out on top, per usual. Outside of John Jones, this guy is just one big winning machine. The UFC heavyweight champion, and still Daniel Cormier, first man to ever defend the UFC light heavyweight title and the UFC heavyweight title. First man to ever do it, putting himself in elite company as a UFC champion. Despite what the naysayers might say, despite the fact that John Jones, quote-unquote, defeated Daniel Cormier in July of last year, July of 2017. We know what happened after that. John Jones tested positive. DC was given his belt back and defended that title against Oezdemir. Then gets a shot against Stipe, defeats Stipe in a very, very eye-opening performance. Then defends this heavyweight title against Derek Lewis and has set himself up for a massive payday that has already been alluded to time and time again, as DC is slated to now fight Brock Lesnar, which is the biggest payday that you could possibly have in MMA outside of fighting Conor McGregor. And last I checked, Daniel Cormier, as I mentioned, is the heavyweight champion, and Conor McGregor, the former UFC featherweight champion and lightweight champion. So those two words there, feather and light, mixed with heavy, do not go well, obviously. So I'm sure Conor would take the fight. I'm sure Conor would sign the dotted line, the bottom line on the contract to fight a big guy, possibly the heavyweight champ, but that's not going to happen. So, all that being said, really not much of a surprise to see DC win this fight the way he won it. He's won so many fights this way with his dominant wrestling, one of the greatest MMA wrestlers ever, joining the likes of guys like Randy Couture, George St. Pierre, Chael Sonnen. In terms of MMA wrestling, great timing on takedowns, pressure, implementing the takedown. Obviously, Khabib Nurmagomedov comes to mind as well. You wonder, watching Daniel Cormier throughout his career and now seeing the success that Khabib Nurmagomedov has had, you wonder what DC was able to teach Khabib Nurmagomedov, or vice versa, what these guys were able to really learn from each other throughout their training sessions at American Kickboxing Academy. And I have to say, props to DC for being a consummate professional throughout his MMA career. He's represented the sport well. He's represented the UFC well. There are naysayers out there, as always, but facts are facts. He has represented himself as a champion, and that's why he is a champion, a two-weight champion. And regardless as to whether or not Jones versus Gustafsson 2 will be attested for the UFC light heavyweight title, and DC might possibly get stripped of that light heavyweight title come December 29th. He will be stripped, I should say. I still truly believe that, that DC deserves the right to fight one of those two guys, but whether he will or not remains to be seen. I think he's closed the book, if you will, on the John Jones thing, because really DC doesn't have to fight John Jones again, because he did lose to John Jones twice. Him getting this fight versus Stipe Miocic and winning it allowed DC to add another chapter to his career, extend his career in a way that he never knew possible. He needed that light heavyweight belt in order to fight the heavyweight champion. And coming off a loss, there's no way they were going to give him a title shot in another weight class. They've done it before with Chael Sonnen, but I didn't see that happening, especially with how big that fight was, and the sport was at a very different place than it was now. Was then than it is now. So all that being said, great performance by DC. I really appreciate watching his career these last 10 years. To think that this guy went from being a alternate in a Strikeforce Grand Prix and seeing what he has become It's truly remarkable. There's a guy out there in Bellator that'll be fighting in the welterweight Grand Prix, the Bellator welterweight championship tournament. And that guy is by the name of Ed Ruth, who reminds me a lot of Daniel Cormier. I expect to see very similar success in terms of the beginning of their career. Whether or not Ed Ruth becomes a two-division champion remains to be seen. But you see this once, you see this twice, you've seen it so many times. Wrestling is the most dominant facet of mixed martial arts. It always has been, and it always will be. I know Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is one hell of an art. If you're looking to finish a fight, that's, without taking any damage, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is the way to do it. But wrestling, implementing your game plan, pressuring, initiating the takedown, maintaining top position, that is a hell of a way to win a fight. That is as dominant a way as you can win a fight, as demoralizing as a way you could win a fight. And I know Derek Lewis is probably feeling more demoralized right now than just about anybody. He wanted to really win this fight. He wouldn't have signed the bottom line if he didn't. And I feel sort of bad for Derek Lewis for the sole principle that many people were not giving him the due diligence that really he deserved. Derek Lewis is a tough fighter. Derek Lewis is a competitor. Derek Lewis is not a bum. Derek Lewis has won 9 of his last 11 now fights. Heading into this fight, you can do the math. He'd won 9 of his last 10 fights. So to say Derek Lewis was a little bit of a scrub against Daniel Cormier, that's just not true. This was a very risky fight for Daniel Cormier to take, and we saw moments where Derek Lewis landed some really big punches, and those big punches were, Derek Lewis landed them on Daniel Cormier, where Cormier thought to himself, holy shit, I'm really in the midst of a battle here, and he had to take the fight to the ground. Daniel Cormier did not want to stand with Derek Lewis. Could you blame him? Hell of a performance by both guys, though, to take this fight on 4 weeks' notice. Much props to both of them. They really saved a card that was really an utter disaster in terms of the way it was put together and everything like that. I feel like the UFC really needs to do a better job of putting cards together. I know they've had some really great ones, but they've also had some really bad ones. The bad have outweighed the good in terms of the fights. And this was at MSG. This was supposed to be one of the biggest pay-per-views of the year, and it was far, far from it. So that's just my take on that. And I'm going to give you my take on Chris Weidman and Jacare Souza as well in a separate edition of the podcast. But overall, I didn't think it was a great night of fights. It was a night worth going out to the bar and meeting up with some friends and watching the fight, and meeting up with my dad his 53rd birthday. Happy birthday, Dad. All that was fun, and it was good time and everything, but I didn't even get offered dessert. That's the first thing that I thought when I got into the car driving home. I thought I didn't even get dessert. That sucks. I needed that. Not really. But my point is, it was a good night of fights. Could have been better. And I really felt like DC just further, with these heavyweight wins, all he has done is win. Outside of John Jones, I really feel like he deserves more respect, but it is tough when he says that he wants to wear the WWE belt once he beats Brock Lesnar. That was kind of stupid. But outside of that, hell of a performance by DC. And Derek Lewis, chin up, man. You're still a rock star. Your Instagram game is still just badass, hilarious, whatever you want to call it. It is great. Keep it coming. I'm Ryan Thomas. It was the Thomas Take on Daniel Cormier's dominant victory over Derek Lewis at UFC 230, which took place tonight, live on pay-per-view. Thank you so much for tuning in. Take care.